Welcome to our Emotional Intelligence, A Guide to How It Works workshop today. My name is Amy Weiland. I will be your presenter for the next hour. I'm glad that you've called in. I'm glad that you are here. For those of you that are listening to the recorded session, also welcome. The reason for the recording today is basically so people, of course, that can't attend the first time have access to the information, and also for those of you who have called in, it gives you an opportunity to go back and listen again to the information that you, maybe some things that you'd like to revisit, some things you'd like to review. I have to admit that in my background, I have a degree in psychology, and emotional intelligence was one of my favorite subjects. So I'm kind of partial in terms of my loyalty to this idea and this actual scientific things that we've found through research to be of benefit to us personally and professionally. So I promise, I kind of promise that I won't geek out too much on certain things in terms of how emotional intelligence works. But it really is one of those subjects I find to be very beneficial in that I'm the type of person, and I know there are a lot of other people like me, that like the biggest bang for my buck. Meaning if I'm going to learn something, I want it to apply in a lot of different areas of my life. This is such a topic. This is something that translates very well into our professional life and our personal life. So as we talk about it today, I want you to think of it in both areas. How you interact with people at work, how you can use your emotional intelligence with your children or your loved ones or your significant other. So again, it's one of those topics I think is important. It's definitely a valuable thing to learn, and I'm glad to be presenting today. Now, by way of housekeeping items, today's session will be about an hour. I would like to leave a little bit of time at the end for any questions. However, I'm a very flexible presenter. I don't mind being interrupted with questions. That's why we have a chat box. That's why you have an unmute button that I'd like for you to be able to contribute to our discussion. Now, because we are at a bit of a disadvantage where we're not all in the same room and you can't see me and my random flailing hand gestures and I can't see you raising your hand or maybe nodding off in the back, I don't have any visual feedback. I hope that it won't deter you, this tricky medium, that it won't deter you from contributing to our conversation today. Ultimately, we know that we learn really well by interacting, by actually doing and applying the things that we're learning. So in order to do that, I'd like for you to give me comments. I'd like for you to ask questions as we go through our session. As I mentioned, I don't get offended if I get interrupted. It's absolutely fine, and I will do my absolute best to keep my eye on the chat box to make sure that I do see those questions as they come in. If I miss it, I apologize. I'll see it at the end. We'll review, and then we'll talk about those concerns that you might have, or maybe if you need clarification on one particular topic. So again, this is your webinar. This is something I'd like you to kind of formulate. So if there's a topic that you think is particularly fascinating, we'll talk even about neurology today, that stop me and we'll talk a little more about it. So before we jump in, I'd like for you to consider a few different scenarios to kind of see how you view your own emotional intelligence. And then we'll go into specifics in a moment. Imagine a situation where you're sitting at home, you're finishing up dinner, your child walks through the door and they're fine, they're physically okay, they might be a little emotionally rattled, but they tell you they have just wrecked the family car. It's totaled, they've made it home okay, but you no longer have this car. What is your reaction? What is your response? What do you do? Maybe another different scenario. So again, I want you to be thinking of these things as we go through the session, kind of doing some self-assessment. Think of maybe a work situation where you're sitting in a big conference room, you're excited to present your ideas for an upcoming project, a task that you're involved in. You've spoken it over with one of your colleagues, and as you go to present, your coworker suddenly starts talking about your ideas. and claiming them as their own. So you don't get the credit for the hard work that you've done and for the ideas that you have. What's your reaction? What's your response? Because there is a difference. And ultimately, what do you do? So we'll talk about different ways that we can get through situations like this. We'll talk about the difference between immediate reaction and thoughtful response. Self-assessment is part of this process, figuring out where you are. Another thing I would encourage as we go through our session is to be thinking of your own emotional intelligence. I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, I wish John would listen to this. He needs to know this stuff. Sometimes we think that, and we wish other people would be a little emotionally intelligent more so, right? But instead, we're going to really focus on how we can build our own and how we can be aware of those around us and how we affect them. One thing we also do know about emotional intelligence is that men and women have equal capacity to have high emotional intelligence. This is not dependent on the sex of the person. Instead, it is maybe one sex or one gender has a tendency to have greater empathy more naturally. Another gender might have a better ability to manage distressing feelings. But the truth of the matter is, and what we're finding through the studies, through current research, is that both genders, both sexes, actually have an equal capacity to have emotional intelligence. So this is not something just for women or just for men. We can all have this. So emotional intelligence is more than just emotional maturity, and we'll make that distinction as we go through our session today. But let's look at kind of what emotional intelligence isn't first. Maybe you've known some people that just maybe didn't get it. They were in a situation where they're very intellectual. They know the facts. Their IQ is off the charts, but they missed cues. And we're not talking about things on a spectrum in terms of maybe autism or things like that, but we're talking about people that just something is off. They just don't pick up on those cues very well. They just don't really get it. They can't relate to people. Maybe they lack a little bit of tact, and they're consistently saying the wrong things. People are getting offended by what they say. Maybe they make interesting choices, that they do the wrong things, that they don't know how to interact effectively. Perhaps they're the type of person that they just don't get along with anyone, that they maybe are very inconsistent. Maybe they get angry very easily, so it's difficult for people to be around them. Maybe they miss cues at meetings or parties. They just can't see how other people are affected by maybe what they're doing or what's happening in that current situation. Maybe they're the type of individual that it's just difficult to be around them. It's awkward, or maybe you view them as rude or tactless. Maybe someone who just was a little annoying. Maybe they just kind of drove you crazy. So this is what emotional intelligence is not. And we'll talk about these things today, about really understanding and getting it. Again, another thing about emotional intelligence that I want to really draw a distinction on is that this doesn't mean that everyone with emotional intelligence is an extrovert or someone that is very comfortable in speaking with other people. That's not what it's about. People that are more introverted, people that have a difficult time speaking with people, can still have very high emotional intelligence. It doesn't mean that we have to be very comfortable speaking with people, but just that we know kind of other people's cues and how to interact with people, and also how to understand our own emotions as well. And that's kind of the distinction between emotional maturity and knowing ourselves and how we react to certain things, and emotional intelligence, which also involves other people, understanding other people, picking up on cues, looking at body language to kind of decipher what the true message is that people are sending. So it's important that we know those types of things. Now, I want to give a little bit of background on what emotional intelligence is, just because I think it lends credibility to the idea of what emotional intelligence is and how it can help us. It's a fairly new field of study. Emotional intelligence was kind of developed by three men. at Yale, Salovey, Mayer, and Caruso. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to figure out how they know about intellectual quotient. They wanted to know about how people relate emotionally, and if people can be very smart emotionally. So they developed this idea. It was picked up and kind of forwarded, if you will, by Daniel Goleman. He's kind of the person that is mostly well known for current research on the topic. It intrigued him. He wanted to see how we could find applications for this in the workplace. So he did a lot of research on companies and how successful companies were based on their ability to have emotional intelligence, based on managers' ability to influence their employees by way of emotional intelligence. So we know that it's valid. We know that it's something that's important. We know that it affects people, and it also affects our business. So part of this emotional intelligence is self-awareness, really understanding how we feel and how we are reacting because of those feelings. So we'll talk about that today. We're going to talk about building a vocabulary, essentially, for what emotions are. We'll talk about why that's important. Because if we don't understand how we feel or how we're reacting to something or what's causing us to react instead of respond, then we can't fix it. If we don't know what it is or what's causing it, it won't get better. It also helps us focus on how our actions and what we're doing is affecting other people. It also helps us understand at the core of what we're feeling. So we'll discuss learning to understand exactly what we're feeling, actually putting a label on it and why that's important. We'll also discuss how what we're feeling affects our mood, which in turn can affect our actions, which in turn can affect those around us. Can you see this theme? That as human beings, we genuinely are connected. We know that neurologically we have what are called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons actually connect us to other people. They help us relate to other people. In that, think of when you're watching a video online and someone falls, what happens? You have almost a physical reaction, especially if it looks like it hurts. You pull your hands up next to your chest. You say, oh. The reason for that is, although we don't experience that in that moment, we can imagine what it would feel like. And those mirror neurons fire in our brains, and they connect us to people. We suddenly try to understand them, not necessarily because we've fallen off the skateboard and hurt ourselves, but we can imagine what it feels like. So again, understanding our emotions helps us understand the emotions of those around us. So our mood does affect other people. And we'll talk about the science that's behind how our emotions and our moods are contagious and why that's important to understand in the workplace. So first we have to understand what emotions really are. Again, remember in 5th and 6th grade when you had to do vocabulary and you were sitting down and you were given a word and you had to define it and you wanted to understand it. That's what we need to do with emotions. Now we have what are called primary emotions, and we have what are called secondary emotions. And primary emotions are very advantageous to us. We as human beings want to protect ourselves. It is survival a lot of times. So primary emotions help us do that. For example, fear is a good emotion. Because if we are in a situation and we somehow sense that something is going to do us harm, that fear sends that impulse to our brain that we need to do something. We need to leave. So the primary emotions are very advantageous. They actually motivate us to do something that will help us. So, and each one of these emotions listed in our primary section they all have value. They all do something for us. So we can see that joy is good for us. Of course, happiness, satisfaction, fulfillment. Even further down, guilt can actually be something that is good for us. And there's a distinction between guilt and shame. Guilt is something that kind of makes us feel like, wow, I said something really rude to that individual, And that's not okay because it affected them. I damaged that relationship I had with them. In that case, the guilt is a teacher. That guilt is, I should do things differently next time. Shame can be difficult and can be harmful if we attach our value to it. Instead of saying, I probably shouldn't do that, what I did was probably wrong, instead we say, I am wrong, I am a problem. So again, these are emotions that can be beneficial unless they go into what we call the secondary emotions. Basically, what a secondary emotion is, think of it like you have a weed in your yard. And the primary emotion is the root of that weed. And you want to get rid of that feeling. You want to get rid of the guilt. You want to get rid of the shame or the fear. And if I want to get rid of it, if I just pull off the top part of the weed, which is like a secondary emotion, the weed stays there and it continues to grow. So the secondary emotion is very elusive. It's hard to understand because it's not beneficial. So let's say I feel paranoid, where I feel like, I bet they think I'm not doing a good job at work. Maybe I'm not doing a good job. Oh, she's looking at me strangely. Why is she looking at me like that? I bet she thinks I'm dumb. Is this to our advantage? It's not. So paranoia is a secondary emotion to fear, or could be to fear, that we think I'm not doing well enough. So what we need to do is when we're experiencing these types of emotions, such as worry or anxiety, is we need to then assess what its root is, what it really is. Because again, ripping off the top part of that weed is not going to get rid of it. But we want to get rid of that. We don't want to feel anxious. We don't want to feel worry. And when we feel those emotions, because they are secondary, they're not going to get us, they're not going to allow us to progress. So if we can then analyze it and say, why am I worrying? Is it because I feel guilty? Is it because I feel dissatisfied? Do I feel frustrated? Do I feel fearful because I have this innate sense of I'm going to fail? So again, the primary emotions are there for a reason. They move us to action. The secondary, they essentially immobilize us. We can't fix anything if we have these secondary emotions. So again, it's learning the vocabulary, feeling like I'm feeling really sad, or I'm feeling really hurt, or I'm feeling dissatisfied. These are good things. These are normal things. These are again, things that motivate us. And this is a good vocabulary to have. So again, when we're experiencing these secondary emotions, we want to assess what the true cause is so we can do away with it, especially if it is damaging relationships, if it is standing in the way of us being productive at work, then we need to figure out what the root cause is. So to give you a little bit of vocabulary. So again, forwarding this idea of self-awareness, which is key in establishing our own emotional intelligence, is we need to know what it is that we feel. So can we go back to those primary emotions and say, actually, I'm not worrying so much as I'm fearful that something might happen, and it could be a variety of things. So what does this mean? How do I fix this? One thing that we've found in the area of psychology, specifically in some treatment programs, is actually physically writing something down can be very therapeutic. So, and it doesn't have to be, it can be Dear Diary. Today I felt, it can't be like that, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it can even be something so simple as making almost concept maps, writing down I'm angry, and writing down, the words in a circle, and then having offshoots of this is why I'm angry because this happened and this happened and this happened, that it allows us to kind of self-diagnose or dissect those feelings to figure out what's wrong, what's really wrong. And then what we can do is then by kind of breaking that down and self-assessing, we can then figure out what our triggers are as well. Because when we look at someone who is emotionally intelligent, they do have their emotions under control, and we'll talk about how to do that in a moment. But first we have to figure out what's at the core of it. When I'm angry, what do? I yell. So when we're yelling, we say, I must be angry. Why am I angry? Or I'm crying. Why am I crying? I'm sad. What am I sad about? What's at the core? I'm shutting down. And this is something that I've seen with a lot of people. When I'm hurt, I shut down. Or sometimes when someone feels inferior or they feel overwhelmed with maybe a task at work or a new responsibility, they start to shut down. That means sometimes it's a physical thing. Sometimes they retreat. Sometimes people start to shut down emotionally and they just go numb. So again, it's important that when we are experiencing certain things that we can almost compartmentalize them or make them very logical and figure out what's at the core of it. I'm crying. Why am I crying? I'm shutting down. I feel overwhelmed. And then what it does is it then allows us to make a plan. It allows us to have options. If I'm yelling, when I'm angry, then I have to figure out what to do to not get to that angry point. Another thing that people have journaled is when they're overwhelmed, they make mistakes. Isn't that the truth? When our brain is going a million miles an hour, suddenly things are falling through the cracks. So again, when we're looking at our behavior, we have to figure out what emotion is driving that behavior in order to fix it, particularly if we really do want it to be fixed. So one thing we also want to do is, as we're self-assessing and we're becoming more self-aware, we also need to understand other emotions or how we interact with other people. So we've discussed ourselves, but now we want to bring in more social skills. This is where we start involving those around us, whether it's a brother or our sister or our children or our loved ones, coworkers, that we want to build those social skills as well. So what we want to do is we want to be a better listener. It sounds simple, doesn't it? A lot of these concepts will. Does it make it easy? No. If it were easy, we'd all be doing it consistently, right? And then, I'd be out of a job because I wouldn't have to teach how to do it. But it's the simplest answer oftentimes that's very effective. So how to be a good listener? This means that we're listening with our eyes, that we're actually looking at the person. So again, we're building this emotional intelligence, that we're connecting with people, and they can see that we're intrigued. So not looking at our phones when someone is talking to us. When someone comes in our office, we don't look at the computer, we look in their face. That we clarify, that we say, so I think what you're telling me is this, is that right? Or I think you're frustrated because of this, is that what you're saying? And that you also ask questions. When we're asking questions, it shows that we're invested in that conversation. Also, that we follow up with the conversation later on. That way the person knows that we truly were listening. Another thing we need to do is really look at the other person's body language. Now, this is a huge component of emotional intelligence because sometimes this is what people really miss. Someone is saying something. Let's say they say, I'm fine. I'm doing okay. But they're in the corner with their arms folded, curled up in a ball. We know that they're not really feeling that way. And of course, that's an extreme case. But really being able to look at someone's body language, they're folding their arms in front of their chest. They're kind of hunched over, but they're saying they're fine. So what are they really feeling based on what they're telling us with their physical appearance? Do their tones and their emotions match? It's picking up on these little cues. And what we can do is, it's a simple technique. I tried it a couple of years ago to see if it really works. It's something that I could say I developed it, but it's an idea that I've seen work within companies. And it's simple, so you can remember it. It's O-A-O, right? Like the soldiers that are marching into the Wicked Witch of the West's castle. O-A-O. Now that's stuck in your head, and I apologize, but the concept is O-A-O, observe, ask, and offer. When you're not sure, when you can't really tell what their body language is telling you, that's when you get to observe. So you're looking at them, and you see that their arms are folded, or you see that they look upset. They look sad, maybe. Then you observe, and you say, you look upset. You can ask, are you upset? Or is everything okay? And then offer is, how can I help? What can I do for you? How can we make this situation better? This is fantastic across the board. If you are someone in a position of leadership, this is something you can do when you have a difficult conversation with one of your employees. It's simple. It's very effective. It's not confrontational because we're offering help. And it's important that immediately after the observation, we don't want them to get defensive, because they might, especially if it's something where you're having a difficult conversation, like you seem really angry. They could respond with, well, I am angry. But instead we say, is everything okay? How can we help you? How can we resolve this? How would you like to see this end? What will be beneficial in your mind? So again, not only assessing how they're standing and what they're doing, but their overall tone, and asking that question, how can we help? And offering. So observe, ask, and offer. And also it involves becoming more comfortable with sharing our own emotions. I'm feeling really frustrated. I need to walk away. I'm feeling really upset. I feel like I'm really emotionally charged right now. I'm leaving for 5 minutes, but I will come back. So again, it's observing other people's emotions, understanding your own, and building also that empathy for them and what they could be experiencing. So I promised I wouldn't geek out too much, but I do want to geek out just a little bit to kind of illustrate how this process actually works. When we're taking in what we're seeing from other people, how we're breaking it down, and how we're using that information. So again, I won't geek out too much, but a little bit. We know that emotional intelligence is not a theory. We know that it is based in neurology. We know that it actually happens. We know that different components of our brain, different parts of our brain, are responsible for various function. So the thalamus, and this is something you can use around the water cooler today, the thalamus, is actually our relay center. So this is where the information is coming in. We're translating it. We're shooting it off to where it needs to go. There's also the hypothalamus. That's a portion of this midbrain area that regulates, or at least interprets, temperature and how we're feeling physically and all of those things. And this is kind of the relay center between our conscious and our subconscious, what we're actually thinking and what is already there. And this is where kind of reaction comes into play. We'll talk in a moment about our sympathetic nervous system and how it just kind of kicks in sometimes. And not that we can blame things on our sympathetic nervous system, but we want to kind of control things. So we can't say, I yelled at you because of my sympathetic nervous system. But instead, we're going to take more control. The cortex is this thinking center. This is where the information is coming in. We're making sense of it. We're trying to break it down. We're trying to respond in a more educated way. And we know that through this entire process, our amygdala, which is actually, if we could move that arrow back, is actually more in the lower midbrain, kind of where that pink part is, not necessarily at the frontal area. But basically what the amygdala is it helps us regulate emotional responses. Our amygdala is involved in all of our experiences. It's also at a portion of the brain that helps with emotional memory as well, in the hippocampus as well. So that amygdala is, again, it's the memory, it's the emotional core. And so as we're processing all of this information, our emotions are involved every single time, whether or not we can pinpoint it, or whether or not we can say, yep, that's exactly what I was feeling right when you told me that. Instead, it's just this subconscious. It's involving that amygdala, and every time our emotions are involved in this thought process. So what we can do is this is how we can start changing our behavior, understanding the breakdown of how information is received, where we compartmentalize it, how we use our amygdala to feel those emotions and ultimately make it better for ourselves. So how does emotional intelligence or our emotional quotient really work? Think of it this way. When you experience a very stressful situation, it could be you're driving in your car and suddenly there's traffic. That's frustrating, isn't it? That's what we call an external stressor, something we don't have control over. It just happens, and it's frustrating. Maybe we're awakened by a scary noise, and suddenly what happens? Our heart starts pumping. It's a physiological response. Yelling at work, maybe when someone is yelling at us or we feel moved to yell. We get a worrying email or a phone call. Maybe a deadline is quickly approaching. Maybe we get bad news. These, again, are what we call external stressors, things that happen to us. So a couple of things can happen. Our immediate response, I'm sure you've heard this term, is fight or flight. That means we get this surge of energy, especially when, let's say it's that we're awakened by a scary noise. We get this almost primitive feeling to protect ourselves. We don't know what's coming, and it feels very out of control, and we don't like that. So our sympathetic nervous system that is activated in the lower regions of our brain suddenly makes us spring to action. That's why our heart starts pumping. That's why sometimes before you get up in front of people and you get nervous, that you can feel yourself getting warm and your heart starts pumping because it thinks this is stress and I need to be ready to flee if I need to. So all of the blood rushes to our major areas, right, down into our quads just in case we need to run. Our eyes suddenly become very focused and we can see things really well. It's this physiological knee-jerk response. A reaction, not a response, a reaction. It just happens. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our session, if someone comes in our home, our teenager comes home and says, I've wrecked the car, we might start to feel a little warm. We might start to feel that knee-jerk reaction coming on, those lower regions of the brain where we want to immediately react with yelling. We can feel that and we're suddenly upset. What we want to do is instead of, and it will be a physiological response, we can't reprogram that portion. However, what we can do is start then employing what we call our parasympathetic nervous system that's activated the higher regions of our brain, our more sophisticated thought process. So what we do is it starts to calm ourselves. It starts to kind of employ more logical thought. Instead of immediately reacting and yelling at our child or yelling at the coworker who just stole your idea, even though you really want to yell and get upset, but instead we activate that portion of our brain where we understand consequence as well. So it's that calming response where we more logically look at the situation and work to fix it instead of just this scream and yell. So how do we do this then? How does this actually happen? One thing we can do, of course, is simple techniques that we'll talk about in a moment by way of pausing or walking away or taking in oxygen so that our parasympathetic can overtake. And instead of things going, or all of our effort and our energy going to just survival mode, where it's just instinct, instead it's relaxed and we can think more logically. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But what's also important to consider, especially in those moments of stress and frustration, is employing empathy, is really looking at things from a situation or from a standpoint of how is the other person feeling? What are they experiencing? So if my teenage daughter comes to me, I have a 10-year-old, her name is Tabitha. If Tabitha comes to me when she's 16 and she tells me she wrecks the car, my immediate reaction might be, you did what? That's what I'm thinking in my head, right? But when we use our emotional intelligence, we then employ empathy and we think, and this is part of the process, again, of de-escalating this stress response, is we think, how are they feeling? Is she shaken up? Probably. She's been through a very traumatic experience. She didn't want to wreck the car. She didn't want to have that happen. So trying to understand how they're feeling. So even when we say something out loud, it starts changing our brain cognitions as well. So if I even say something sympathetic or empathetic to my daughter and say, I bet that was really scary. Are you okay? Then suddenly my cognitions look at things in a very positive way. I'm focusing on her and making sure she's okay, and then eventually I'll work out the details later. So we know that in those situations, let's say even from the boardroom situation when someone takes credit, we're mad, right? And justifiably so. However, if we then react immediately instead of respond, how is that going to affect them? How is that going to affect our credibility? How is it going to affect the overall situation? Instead of really responding and speaking with them and saying, I really appreciate you talking about my ideas. I like that. Let me give you some additional information, and then you approach the entire room with that information. So instead of yelling, which is to no one's advantage, doesn't help you, doesn't help the person that stole your stuff, but instead reacting more logically is more effective overall. So kind of figuring out, even in that moment when you're really upset with that person, let's say for taking credit, you think, why would they do that? What is their motive? Do they feel insecure in their own abilities to contribute? And again, trying to employ that empathy can help you respond better. Anticipate how they might be feeling, as well as how you are feeling in that moment. Empathy is huge. It's a very good way to connect with people as well. One thing that we also know about emotions is that they can be changed very quickly, actually. That when we start with certain cognitions, our brain tries to make sense of them, thinking, well, if I mentioned this a moment ago, if I'm saying something, then I must believe it. So if I am saying something positive out loud, or if I am expressing concern for someone, I must genuinely be concerned. So it de-escalates and makes us feel better. So we can start changing our emotions. Think of things that make you feel better almost instantaneously. Some people like to have a lucky rabbit foot. I don't know, whatever works for you. Some people feel as though when they're in those stressful situations, or when they're in those moments of, I feel like I'm going to react very negatively, they can then pull themselves out and kind of take these things that we're going to talk about and use them to de-escalate and use them to respond more effectively. So some people use music to change their mood. Some people try to revisit what's really important to them and the reason they're doing what they're doing. Let's say you leave that meeting and you're still feeling really frustrated with your coworker, almost having that sense of, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I with this company? Why am I working on this task? Sometimes, well, nearly all the time, the reason people have pictures of their family and their loved ones is to remind themselves of the reason they're doing what they're doing. It's we call it their big why. Why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing it for them, but I'm also doing it for me. And even figuring out, and some people actually have pictures of 1966 Mustangs they're restoring, that kind of centers them again, where they can look at it and say, okay, I'm doing this so I can restore that 66 Mustang, or you know what, I'm going to be okay if I can make it till 5 o'clock today. Then I get to go home and work on it again. So is there a way we can kind of pull ourselves out of this reactive state? The smell of coffee, I know that makes me happy. I love that. Listening to a story about someone who did something amazing. Again, it's really figuring out for you what it is, not necessarily that motivates you, even though that's fantastic, but really starts to change or rewire these cognitions or these thought processes that we go through in our mind. And figuring out what works for you is really beneficial. These are just some options. Also, some additional things that we can do when we want to really control those emotions in the heat of the moment. They sound very simple, but they're very effective. That we need to identify how we feel when we pause, when we feel like okay, I'm going to step back for a second. I'm not going to immediately give you any sort of communication. I just need to walk away for a second. What it does is, as I mentioned before, when it's neurologically based and then when it's transferred to different nervous systems, we need to be able to decompress physiologically as well. So when we need to go from that sympathetic, that reactive state, into that responsive state within the parasympathetic, we need oxygen. We do. It's a physiological response. We've heard people say, take a deep breath, and we think, oh, it's not going to help. But really what it does is it gets oxygen to our brain. It gets oxygen back to our muscles. It tells our body, we're okay. This isn't a primitive stress response where I'm running away from a saber-toothed tiger. This is a response I can handle. This is a stress that I can handle and respond well. So I'm taking deep breaths in order to physically be able to handle this task instead of having this almost very narrow scope that happens when we're in that fight or flight, right? Because we don't see consequences past that narrow scope of right now. So we take deep, deep breaths and we walk away. We do where we can. This is also advantageous when we're having a conflict directly, when we're having an argument, whether it's with a coworker or a loved one, that we say, I'm setting the timer for 5 or 10 minutes. I have to walk away and regroup. Now, I say regroup, I don't mean reload with additional emotional ammunition by which you're going to come back at the person, but instead that you're genuinely walking away and you're thinking, okay, I need to decompress. I need to employ some sort of empathy and try to figure out where you're coming from. I'm going to take deep breaths. Maybe I'm going to go do something that's mindless for a moment, crossword puzzles, those sorts of things. I'm going to figure out some sort of ridiculous hilarity in all of this that's happening. I actually spoke with a woman that had a very tense situation at work, and nearly everyone within the meeting was at odds, very upset, not a good situation, trying to find a solution to a problem within the organization, and she got so upset that she stormed off, right? So that was her sympathetic nervous system. She was done. She was leaving. She was fleeing. It was the flight part. And as she did, she was wearing new high heels, and she fell. And immediately everyone laughed, and it broke the tension enough that they could see that the ridiculousness, how crazy it was that they were so emotionally charged, and instead they figured out a solution. They were more focused, and they revisited different things they could do to solve the problem. So even figuring out humor in things, I don't advise humor at the other person's expense if it's in a tense situation, but some way to find humor that we can relax, take a walk, go around the block. Try to, yes, think about it, but try to get your mind off the deep emotions that you feel. Some people like to take additional time off, paint, draw, cook, do something that makes you feel happy so that when you come back to it, it's funny what happens to our perspective. Because once we've left it and we revisit it when our emotions are a little more in check, we might see it as not as big of a deal as we had originally thought. Our perspective can change. So these are some things we can do to control our emotions. Pause, walk away. So these are some of the things that we've talked about in terms of emotional intelligence and what an emotionally intelligent individual looks like. We know that they're very empathetic. We know that they care how other people feel and that they don't take things at face value. I worked with an HR director a few years ago who, as we were discussing emotional intelligence, pulled me aside at the end of the session, and she mentioned one of the employees within her organization that would consistently come to her and complain about everything. Complained about her coworkers, complained about the overall work environment, complained about the customers that would call in, just basically everything that she could complain about. she did. And it was on a regular basis she did it. She came into HR and they'd, of course, write it down and try to talk her through it. And they kind of essentially pegged her as a very negative individual. And then as they started looking back over her files, they found a common thread, and that was disrespect within her environment, within her immediate environment. That her coworkers would come into her space and take her things, that they would eat candy off her desk, that they were very loud around her desk when she was trying to help customers. And what they found was in seeing this pattern of disrespect, they decided to address the issue, and they did training on a respectful work environment, and things changed. This woman, in turn, was no longer negative. This woman came into work happy. So what had happened was they had made what's called a fundamental attribution error. That means they did not consider the environment to which this woman was subjected. They did not consider the disrespect that was happening. Instead, they just thought she was negative. She's just a complainer. She's not. That's not who she was. That was not her character. But her environment was making her that way. So part of being empathetic is looking at the big picture, looking at all of the pieces of the story. So if we are someone in a position of leadership, we need to be doing that with our employees. What is contributing to their behavior, to what they're doing? Is it disrespect? Are they overloaded with work? Again, this is when we can start the process of OA and O, observe. I noticed, Carolyn, that you've come in a couple of hours late for the last couple of days. Is everything okay? Is there anything we can do to help? And it could be that Carolyn is going through a divorce, and that suddenly she's gone from one daycare to taking her children to another daycare, and it's a lot farther. And she can't get into work on time, and she's experiencing a lot of frustration, maybe a lot of grief, and that's contributing to her behavior. So again, observe. I've noticed this. Ask, is everything okay? Offer, how can we help? What can we do to help you do this? And it also helps when people are feeling overwhelmed at work, our employees are feeling overwhelmed at work, that we ask those questions, that we observe, we ask, we offer. Maybe there's too much on their plate. Looking at our personal relationships as well. I've noticed that you've been really quiet these last couple of days. Is everything okay? How can I help? So again, using that in various situations can be to your advantage. And then trying to employ this empathy. How would I feel if I were in that situation? Brene Brown is an individual that she has a doctorate in social work, and she's done extensive research on shame. She's a phenomenal researcher. She's even a better author, I think, and has released a lot of books on shame and helping people through shame and employing empathy. And one of my favorite quotes from her is, there are magical words, and this isn't word for word, but basically there are magical words that people like to hear from their friends and family, and that's me too. People want to be related to. People want people to understand what they're going through. And empathy is one of those components that we can try to get it. We talked about mirror neurons. We have immediate reactions when we see someone falling off a bike. We immediately can feel what that would feel like. We have that physiological response because of that. So we are connected as people, that we do have influence over those around us, and they have it over us as well, which is a very good thing, can be a very good thing. Also, emotionally intelligent people are very willing to change. They're actually very open to it. The reason for that is people with emotional intelligence can see the big picture. They can also see that progress demands change, and change doesn't threaten their ability to be successful, that they can adapt to things. And it could be that, as we talked about primary and secondary emotions, when they feel that worry coming on, whether it's because of the change or they feel the anxiety because of the change, they're able to then look at that emotion and think, okay, the root is really fear, and why am I fearful of the change? Am I fearful? And this is something when I teach change management workshops to people in various industries, the common thread I see is that people are fearful of failure, that they don't want to fail in their professional life, especially when it's very important to them, where they think this new procedure could go really bad for me. I've been doing other things so well. So again, part of this component of emotional intelligence as change is that we recognize not only the emotions that we're feeling, but we also know our skill set, that we have that confidence in what am I really good at and how am I going to make that skill work for me in the situation that is to come. So we can be very open to it and very flexible. Also, emotionally intelligent people are generally positive people. They're people that are optimistic for the same reasons that they're okay with change. That they understand that their future is essentially what they make it. Bad things might come their way, but they can learn from that. They can reframe, which means they step back and see what has happened, and they can move forward with that new information and use it to their advantage, even in tragic situations. For example, I lost my mother to cancer 6 years ago. Very, very troubling time for me and for my family. Difficult time. However, reframing and reassessing and looking at it in a very positive way, I realized that I had a good life with her, that I learned a lot from her. It also made me realize that I really wanted to strengthen relationships in other areas. I wanted to get my grandmother's recipes, different things. But again, reframing means stepping back and saying, what am I going to learn from this? How can I be optimistic for the future with what's happening right now? How can I make it work for me, even when I'm going through difficult times? Also, emotionally intelligent people focus on achieving goals. They see, again, they're not scared of change. They are very optimistic, and they know that because of those things, great things can happen for them. So they actually write down their goals. They write down maybe a simple 5-year plan, and we could talk about goals for the next 5 hours. But they write down what are called SMART goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, that are they realistic, and that they're timely. So they focus on achieving these goals, but they also include other people, which is my final point. Emotionally intelligent people aren't threatened by those around them. They are inspired by them. Even if that person is working towards the same goal as that individual, an emotional intelligent person will look at them and say, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. They are showing me that it can be done. I don't feel threatened by their success. I feel inspired by it. So they're genuinely happy for other people, knowing that there is enough success to go around. So what does this mean? All of these things that we've talked about, empathy, open to change, optimism, achieving goals, not being threatened by those around them. What does this mean for a work environment with people that are emotionally intelligent? It means productivity. It means that they are effective. They are effective team players. They get things done, and they get things done very well. And they don't feel threatened by those in their team, but instead they feel inspired by them. So we've talked about a lot of things today, and in a moment we'll open things up for questions. But know that this is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. There is so much more to learn about emotional intelligence. There's a lot of books, a lot of literature, and all of these things can be found through, well, not all of them, but a good portion, a lot of things can be found through Anthem, your EAP. So some additional things that are available to you, aside from literature, is through Anthem, you do have face-to-face counseling sessions. So again, we've talked about emotional intelligence. We've talked about our emotions overall. If you're in a position where you'd like to learn a little more, or maybe it kind of triggers something and you think, I want to talk to someone about that. I do feel anxious a lot of the time, and I want to fix it. Or I want to figure out why I respond so intensely to stressful situations. That's what the counseling sessions are for. Everything is absolutely confidential. You can call and make an appointment. Well, actually, what will happen is you call in to Anthem EAP. They're very friendly. They'll talk you through things, and then what they'll do is they'll send you a list of references, or they'll send you a list of people within your area, counselors, therapists in your area that you can meet with. It's no cost to you. It's also no cost to people within your family as well. So it's something you can take advantage of. Of course, there's also legal and financial consultations. There's consultations in terms of elder care and child care and referrals. Daily life resources are available as well as the other things that you can see on your screen. But just know that this is what your EAP is for, to help you with establish a very healthy overall life, teaching things like emotional intelligence, providing additional literature if you need it. Before we close our session, I promised you I would leave some time for questions and answers. If you need any additional clarification on some of the things that we've talked about today, that's what we're here for. What can I help you with?
This is Mary. Could I first ask for your name? I heard you say hello at the beginning, but I don't have who you are.
You bet. My name is Amy Weiland.
W?
E-I-L-A-N-D.
Okay. Excellent. I can't. I think it was just fantastic. I do.
Good. I'm glad. Fascinating topic, don't you think? And there's so much more to learn. And the research is continuing. And it's out there to read as well.
Sure. I think I find it interesting. I'm going to just kind of ask around the topic, without bearing soul or anything. But it's I find my first reaction, while I don't necessarily give it all away, my first reaction is one maybe more of, kind of a pattern of thinking. And then all the other things that you spoke about that bring about emotional intelligence can kick in. But to your point about seeing somebody to kind of get at the root of that initial reaction would be an interesting adventure into self. I think that's great.
Good. It's definitely one of those processes too. And a lot of times it's trial and error, where is this what I'm really feeling? Oh, it's not that. That's not what I'm feeling. Right? And a lot of times when we are doing self-assessments, it's difficult because we can't get to that root, which is why these face-to-face counseling sessions can be really advantageous too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that the stigma of actually meeting with someone is disintegrating. I'm hoping it is.
Mm-hmm.
Good to talk to someone and get another point of view. It's always an advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have any additional questions before we end our session? I hope this has been beneficial. I hope at least it has piqued your interest in the topic. There's fascinating literature on how this affects business. I know there's Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. I'm trying to remember the exact title of the book that he published just within the last couple of years, that talks a lot about leadership and how proper leadership goes hand in hand with emotional intelligence. And successful leaders statistically do better when they have high emotional intelligence, and that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Any other questions before we end today?
Craig went ahead and signed off, so I thank you for everything. You've set a very high bar for all of the other ones we've signed up after you. I don't know if we'll get to hear you again, but it was outstanding. I did have people who told me they couldn't come and they wanted the link, so how do we get the link after this?
Ooh, good question. That is something that we can look for through Anthem directly, and they should be sending it to you. I will close the loop on it and make sure that you do get that in the next, hopefully, 24 hours.
Sounds good. All
right.
Well, thank you, and I wish you the best.
Thank you so much, Mary. It was nice to meet you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.